General Bernard Montgomery didn't joke. If you said something, he took it literally, and one US general discovered this in the worst way possible. Montgomery was instrumental in defeating the Axis forces during World War II. His strategic brilliance, however, was second only to his massive ego and total lack of tact. The man who Winston Churchill himself described as in defeat unbeatable, in victory unbearable. Bernard Law Montgomery, nicknamed Monty, was born in 1887 in London to a particularly strict and zealous family. His father Henry was a minister in the Church of Ireland, while his mother Maud was herself the daughter of a reverend. But Monty never had any plans of following in his parents' footsteps. When he was 2 years old, his father became the Bishop of Tasmania and the family moved to Australia. Under the stresses of his work, his father left the family for months at a time, leaving Monty and his 8 siblings at their mother's mercy. She was overwhelmed with raising a family in a strange new place, and often ignored Monty and his siblings. Yet, when she did pay attention to him, she would give him spectacular beatings, usually for what she saw as insubordination. Perhaps because of his mother's parenting style and their incessant headbutting, Monty developed an inclination for fighting early on. He turned on his smaller, less powerful schoolmates. He'd play cruel, authoritarian games with them, at one point even forcing a group of boys to walk up a ladder and across a roof with their hands tied together. Thankfully, Monty's troubled time in Australia came to an end in 1901 when his family returned to London. But the damage was done. Monty had grown into a fully unpleasant young man. In fact, shortly after, he attended the Royal Military College, Sandhurst, but even the strict officers of the British Army had a tough time straightening him out. His superiors nearly expelled him for his rowdiness and violence, which had to be very rowdy and very violent for the army to consider expelling him. Monty miraculously managed to follow orders long enough to graduate from RMC Sandhurst at the age of 21, and he was eager to get his hands dirty, or bloody. Shortly after graduating, Monty saw some action in India, and perhaps because of his brutality in battle, managed to attain the rank of lieutenant. But it wasn't until the outbreak of World War I that he would really distinguish himself. In the heat of the First Battle of Ypres, Monty fell into a sniper's crosshairs. He took one shot to his right lung and another to the knee. No one expected him to survive his injuries. In fact, the doctors attending to him were so certain that he would only return to Britain in a coffin that the army prepared his grave. Not only did Monty live to tell the tale, but for his gallant leadership, he received the Distinguished Service Order Medal. Then he got right back into the fight. After recovering in 1915, Monty returned to the front lines and continued to distinguish himself, rising up the ranks to the position of staff officer by the time the Allies declared victory. But it was a victory paid for in blood. In Montgomery's eyes, too much blood. Considering his mother's constant beatings, Monty was no stranger to the horrors of cruelty and brutality. But the sheer terror of what he'd witnessed during the war changed him forever. He felt as though generals on both sides of the conflict had a complete disregard for human life. After his experience in World War I, Montgomery found his purpose in life. He saw incompetence in most of the officers around him, and he became determined to devote his life to the arts of war. In order to attain any real rank within the British Army, he knew that he needed an education, and a better attitude. Lacking the right family connections and a basic ability to follow his superiors' orders, Monty failed to get into Staff College, an essential training ground for anyone aspiring to high command in the British Army. But a chance invitation to play tennis brought him face to face with the Commander-in-Chief, Field Marshal Sir William Robertson. He impressed the commander enough to secure himself a position at Staff College. Once again, Monty swallowed his ego long enough to graduate in 1921 as Brigade Major. However, he quickly found himself in an unwinnable situation. Stationed with the 17th Infantry Brigade in Ireland, Monty was tasked with counter-insurgency operations against Irish nationalists. Faced with this no-win situation, Monty abandoned any notion of clemency or pacifism. Ireland was Monty's first real leadership position, and he learned quickly that he wasn't as formidable as he thought he was. In May 1922, he led a substantial force into the town of Macroom in search of some British officers who'd gone missing. He had hoped that his show of force would compel the IRA commander, Charlie Brown, to turn the men over. Brown lured Monty into a trap by agreeing to negotiate outside of the castle gates. Meanwhile, dozens of IRA volunteers had taken up firing positions, completely surrounding Monty and his men. Brown gave him 10 minutes to leave town, and Monty had no choice but to retreat. He didn't know yet, but the IRA had already executed the missing British officers. But it was only payback for the unspeakable things that Monty had done to them. In Ireland, Montgomery unleashed a scorched earth campaign of barbarism. When he wasn't burning people's houses to the ground, Montgomery tried to have some semblance of a personal life, but his fanatical dedication to his career in the British Army made that difficult. It wasn't until he was in his late 30s in 1925 that Monty managed to cobble together something resembling a romantic life. His first ever romantic interest was a 17-year-old girl named Betty Anderson. Apparently, his idea of a romantic walk on the beach included drawing diagrams in the sand of hypothetical troop and armoured vehicle deployments. Needless to say, this didn't exactly impress her, and she turned down his proposal. A few years later, Monty met Elizabeth Carver. As the widowed sister of a British Army officer, she and her 2 sons fit seamlessly into Monty's life. For a while, it seemed like he had managed to make a family for himself. Even his stepsons seemed to admire him, later saying that he'd done a very brave thing in marrying their widowed mother. A few years after their marriage, Monty and Carver had a child of their own, a son named David. But try as he might, Montgomery couldn't escape tragedy. While they were vacationing in Burnham-on-Sea, Carver received a mysterious insect bite. The bite became severely infected, requiring amputation of her leg. Her condition didn't improve, and she developed either sepsis or septicemia. Tragically, all Monty could do was hold on to his wife as she eventually slipped away. Utterly devastated, Montgomery resolved to throw himself into his work right after the funeral. He threw away any hope for a normal life and rededicated himself to the army. He was quickly promoted to the rank of Major General and sent to mandatory Palestine, far away from the tragic memory of his dearly departed wife. While there, the grieving widower took out his frustrations on the Great Palestinian Revolt, crushing all resistance. Less than a year later, he was back in England and pining for another fight. He would get more than he bargained for. Only a few months after his return to England, World War II broke out in Europe. Monty found himself once again in France as part of the 3rd Division. His leadership in the early stages of World War II proved to be invaluable. While the other divisions in France began digging in for defence, Monty drilled the 3rd Division into the finest fighting force west of the Rhine. He often insisted that they carry out their training exercises at night when the conditions were poor. Despite some moaning and groaning from his men, his hard drilling saved lives. By the time the conflict started in earnest, Monty's 3rd Division had already developed a reputation as a very agile and flexible formation, and they would have to be. As France fell to the Axis forces, Monty's 3rd Division was in the right place at the right time to cover the British retreat at Dunkirk. It was during that first deployment to France that some of Monty's quirks made themselves apparent. Perhaps most notable was his strict practice of going to bed at precisely 9:30 every night, artillery fire or no artillery fire. Before he retired for the evening, he gave his men just one order: not to disturb him, unless, of course, there was an emergency. By 1942, the tide was turning in favour of the Allies, and Winston Churchill needed a new field commander in North Africa. Despite, or because of, his reputation for being hard-headed, Churchill chose Monty. But waiting for him in the Sahara was the dreaded German Field Marshal, the Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel. At his very first meeting in the desert with his officers, Monty made it clear that they would either beat Rommel or go to their grave trying. Monty spent months fending off Rommel's repeated offensives and preparing for a tide-turning battle. But to his superiors, it looked like weakness. Back in England, Churchill demanded action, but Monty brushed him off and continued building up the strength of the 8th Army. In late October 1942, much to his superiors' delight and relief, Monty launched his much-anticipated counter-offensive. The Second Battle of El Alamein lasted 12 days and resulted in 13,500 casualties. But Monty had his victory, and most importantly, the opportunity to thumb his nose at those who had doubted him. He had just delivered the Allies one of their greatest land victories since World War II had begun. But there was a cost. Monty's stepson, Dick Carver, fell into enemy hands while out on a scouting mission. What little family Monty had left was now in the hands of the enemy. He exhausted his resources and contacts in a vain attempt to retrieve his stepson. For once, however, the fates were kind. Carver managed to escape on his own and found his way back to Monty in time for Christmas. As Montgomery racked up victory after victory against Rommel, his ego grew bigger and bigger. Too big, in fact, to fit inside the Allies' camp. By the time he was promoted to full general, he found himself working alongside his US allies, George Patton and Omar Bradley. It was said that the three men squabbled like schoolgirls. Even though he was a nightmare to work with, Monty had a decent, if morbid, sense of humour. A photograph taken in 1944 shows him with his two canine friends, one a fox terrier named Hitler, and the other a spaniel named Rommel. In more ways